How is everybody today? Well, I'm feeling a little better today. Myself, you'll probably notice last time I was kind of a fizzle because I'm trying to adjust my medicine. You know, when you get to a certain age, your body just kind of begins to collapse like a brick house that's been bombed. And so I'm trying to adjust my eating and medicine for a new diagnosis of diabetes. In fact, the doctors have looked at everything in my body the last few months except my gizzard. And they're probably going to look at that next week. I go in again. But I hope that you have been doing your reading and that you'll be willing to jump in when there's something that you have read and do not know how to connect or do not understand, because that's very important in this course. Now, last time we talked about early Christianity, and one of the things that we noticed was that ethics was much simpler in early Christianity because it had not yet run into Greek philosophy and philosophical ways of thinking. And ethics is the intellectual evaluation of morality. Most early Christians did not get involved in much of an intellectual evaluation of morality. They were really almost pure deontologists, like we talked about a while back. That is, they simply saw the command of God, and the command of God was their command, and so they tried to do it. For instance, in terms of violence and self-defense and other kinds of things, they just heard what Jesus said. If someone strikes you on one cheek, you turn the other cheek. And therefore they assumed that that was an ethic for the whole of their lives and the whole of their communities, because there wasn't yet even a possibility of Christian ethics having much impact on the community outside of the Christian churches. So the early Christian ethics was really primarily and almost exclusively an ethics of the kingdom of God, in the sense it was an ethic of the Christian community. It is still primarily that. And for that reason, most modern ethicists, just like the reformers, actually attempt to go back to the biblical basis for ethics more than was done, say, in the Middle Ages. In the Middle Ages, philosophical ethics had become so developed and so complex, people just assumed that their ethics were biblical. And so it takes an effort, it takes an intellectual program, so to speak, to try to look at Christian ethics, or try to look at Christian morality and see how it comports with the origins of the Christian faith that are found in the revelation of God, the revelation of Christ, and the revelation that Christians have in the Bible. Because even the Pope in the 20th century assumes that his ethical letters, which he issues quite often, are based primarily in the Bible. He knows that they are not based totally in the Bible because there have been 2,000 years of Christian history since the writing of the Bible. And one of the things that the Pope takes into consideration when he issues an encyclical about some moral subject is what later came to be known after the early church as natural law. There's no discussion of natural law in the New Testament. There's just discussion of positive law. That is, Jesus said, God said to do this, and you do it. Jesus said to do this, and you do it. You may not know why. It may take you a long time to understand why. For instance, it takes some guys a long time to understand why the Bible says thou shalt not commit adultery. By the time they understand it, it's too late. It takes a long time sometimes for people to understand the importance of forgiveness. And by the time they learn the importance of forgiveness, they've lived lives with a great deal of misery because they're unable to have good relationships with people, because we find out that everybody is fallible and everybody doesn't do right all the time. So if we don't have a fairly developed concept of forgiveness, then our marriages can't last very long, our relationships with our friends can't last very long, and our relationships with a wider community can't last very long. So ethics basically is kind of deliberating upon the meaning of moral laws. And the early church, after the writing of the New Testament, began to deliberate on the meaning of moral laws by using tools that were available to them when they came into European society. These were the tools of philosophical ethics. I've emphasized that the Bible is not a philosophy book, and Christian ethics are not primarily a philosophy. They're not even primarily ethical principles. Christian ethics, just like the Christian faith, is primarily a story. You learn how to live your story by learning how God and Jesus Christ lived their story. In other words, if we want an example of what it means to love, the example of what it means to love in Christianity is the love of God, or the love of Jesus Christ. So in that sense, it was simpler. They just reverted to the concept of revelation. And some of the early Christian ethicists, such as Tertullian, reacted very strongly against using ethical principles or ethical rational discussion from the philosophers. But it happened. In other words, Christians still argue whether it was inevitable, because there have been throughout Christian history Christians who have managed all the way through that history to reject the use of traditional philosophical thought in trying to explicate Christianity. And sometimes that turn of mind creates, for instance, some extreme sectarianism, where people have no basis upon which to have anything in common, even with some other Christians, much less anything ethically in common with the surrounding culture. People like Clement of Alexandria, we're talking about the 2nd century, 100 years, Clement was born more than 100 years after the death of Christ. And he was a Greek philosopher in the traditional sense, in that he believed, even after he became a Christian, that the Greek philosophers were predecessors to the Christian faith. Just especially for the Gentile Christians, it's not exactly like, but similarly to the fact that the Old Testament and the Jewish faith was a predecessor to Christianity for Christian Jews. So they sometimes argued whether Socrates would go to heaven. Well, somebody like Tertullian may just say, well, no, Socrates isn't going to go to heaven. Socrates was a pagan. But somebody like Clement of Alexandria might argue that Socrates could go to heaven because Socrates was, in a sense, a conduit of the natural law of God. And the natural law of God can be discerned through human wisdom. It has to be fine-tuned, and it has to be transformed by the Christian message. But there's still a basis there for commonality. And as a philosopher, Clement of Alexandria and Origen, these were two guys in what is called the Alexandrian school. The greatest Christian theologians in the early centuries were Africans, North Africa. Clement of Alexandria and Origen were from Alexandria, Egypt. Augustine was from another part of North Africa, which is included now in Algeria. And So that's an important thing for Western people to know, because lots of times Western people think of Christianity as a Western religion. Christianity wasn't a Western religion. Christianity, like all other religions, is an Asian religion. It began in Asia. In this case, it was Western Asia, where Palestine and Turkey and so forth were located. And it first moved, at least in its intellectual movement, to North Africa. So North Africa was actually kind of the center of Christian theology, the center of Christian thought, up until the Muslims conquered North Africa. And now all we think of when we think of North Africa is Islam, when there are still millions of Christians in North Africa that go back to almost the first century. In fact, some of them can trace themselves back to the first century. But Clement wanted to make Christianity respectable to the intellectual. Christianity went like wildfire among the common people. It went like wildfire even among people that we might consider kind of middle class, but who were not particularly interested in the philosophical intellectual life. Even Plato had very few followers. In order to be a follower of Plato or Aristotle, or a follower of the Stoics, or a follower of the Epicureans, you had to be kind of a philosophical person. So Plato didn't expect very many people in all the world to be saved through philosophy. Well, that is the genius of the Christian faith in contrast to philosophy, and that is the Christian faith does not require you to be a philosopher in order to be saved. In Christian faith, in fact, philosophy does not save you. Theology does not save you. Theology is simply the attempt of Christians to try to understand how they are being saved. And that's an important idea for a lot of modern people, because sometimes people put, theology is extremely important. Understanding the Bible is extremely important. But lots of times people, even fairly uneducated sectarian Christians, put too much emphasis on the intellect, as if it was the intellect that saved you, as if it was knowing exactly the right things that saved you. So one of the contributions of these philosophers was to introduce us to very profound thinking among non-Christians. And they could see that these non-Christians came up with some profound ideas about how to live life. And they also came up with some profound ideas about God. And they learned that the way the Bible talks about God is not the only way you can talk about God. And I'll give you an illustration of that in just a minute. Now that again is almost necessary when you move into a different culture to try to understand how these people talk about God. That's what Paul did, you remember, in Acts when he went up to Mars Hill in Athens. I got on Mars Hill about a year ago, and I don't know how similar it is to what it was when Paul was there, but it is a dangerous place to be. It's very slippery, and you have to kind of take your life in your own hands to try to walk up and get on top of Mars Hill. It's a little bitty place. But anyway, this was the place where Athenian philosophers listened to new ideas. So when Paul comes to Athens, he doesn't come in and say, "Oh, you bunch of idiots, you're worshiping all these gods, and you have no idea what God is or what God is all about." What he said instead was a kind of an accommodationist thing, just like Clement of Alexandria. What he said was, "I see by looking around town that you are very religious people. You are so religious that you even have a little shrine down here, and on the shrine it says, 'To an unknown God.'" Well, he doesn't say that God is a bunch of baloney. What does he say? I'm going to tell you about that God. In other words, he begins with their intellectual, with whatever it is in their concepts, which is intellectually profound, and then he begins to tell them about the Christian God. In other words, from his perspective, God is God. And if somebody in Greece has thought profoundly about God, he may not have heard the Jewish or Christian story, and so there are a lot of things that he still needs to know about God, particularly his personality, his love, his revelation, his reaching out to people. People need to know that. But you can begin where the people are. And there were very good pagan philosophers who were well acquainted with Christianity in its kind of primitive form. And they argued that Christianity was simply another superstition. And that if you really wanted to be intellectual, if you really wanted to be up to date, you needed to just dump Christianity and go back to Plato, or if you were a Jew, go back to Philo. And Philo and Plato, from their perspectives, had as profound a concept of God as you can have. Well, even a modern theologian would say there's some truth to that. There's some problem with that. Now, in that light, I'm going to read you a passage from Clement of Alexandria about God. And this is a passage about God which has some ideas which sometimes religious people come to after being Christians for decades. But it finally dawns on them that their concept of God is too small. J.B. Phillips, who was an English theologian, wrote a book years ago called Your God is Too Small. The purpose of this course, as I've already indicated, is not to convert you to belief or disbelief in God. But the purpose of this course is to help you to understand that there are probably different views of God, more profound views of God, than those that you have thus far heard of or thought of. And that might help you sort out your own understanding of whether there is a God or whether there's not a God, and if there is a God, what kind of God he is. Listen to Clement of Alexandria. This sounds like a very modern statement. And it was written in 100-something AD. No one can rightly express, this is on page 39 in your book, if you want to take a note on that. No one can rightly express him, that is God, holy. Now that is a bedrock assumption of theology. You cannot express everything there is to know about God. It's what philosophers call epistemological humility. Just like you have to have humility about the way you live your life, you have to have humility about the power of your intellect. A human being is just one little bag of neurons and so forth, walking around amongst millions of other little bags of neurons. We are not that intelligent. We are as intelligent, we're the most intelligent physical beings in the world, but we're really not all that intelligent. To contrast the intelligence and the knowledge and the capability of a human being with the actual character and nature of God is just almost an infinite difference, an absolute difference between human beings and God. So even though from the biblical perspective God has attempted to reveal himself to us, and even though philosophers like Plato tried through reason to understand God, any of these philosophers or theologians with any epistemological humility or Christian humility, either one would do, would realize that what he knows about God is very little. And you don't have to know everything there is to know about God in order for God to be related to you or for you to be related to God, and for God to be saving you. If he wasn't that much bigger than you, he couldn't save you to start with. And so Clement begins by saying, no one can rightly express him wholly. For on account of his greatness, he is ranked as the all, and as the Father of the universe. Now notice as I read these, most of these expressions are Platonic expressions. Nor are any parts to be predicated of him, for the one, capital O-N-E, that's Neoplatonism. The Bible never calls God the one or the good. The Greek philosophers called God the one or the good. And what Clement is saying is the Greek philosophers weren't far off when they talked about God. They just didn't know his name, so to speak. That's what Paul was telling the people, the philosophers on Mars Hill in Athens. That the God that you worship ignorantly, I'm going to tell you about him, because he has sent someone at the right time to be your Redeemer. And that one has died on the cross and has been raised from the dead. Well, that's an idea that just did not exist in philosophical thought. The idea that God could in some way reach out to human beings and become human himself, even their conception of God did not allow for God to be able to become human himself. Now, a lot of people assume that that means that the biblical view of God is more primitive than the philosophical view. But one thing I would like to just throw out for you to think about is that how can a view in which God can do more things be primitive in comparison to a view of God in which there's something that God cannot do? And from the Christian, that's an important point when we're discussing in between religions, between Jews and Christians and Muslims. Because whether or not it is true or not, Christianity believes that God can do something that Islam, Judaism, and Platonism does not think he can do. That is, he can become human, which means he transcends in himself these distinctions, which are so important to us, and is able to actually come to us in a way which a philosophical, rational philosophy could not anticipate. But anyway, Clement is still using pagan, Neoplatonic terminology. The one is indivisible, wherefore it is also it is infinite, not considered with reference to inscrutability, but with reference to its being without dimensions, not having a limit. Now, that's philosophical way of talking. The Bible believes similar things about God, but it doesn't talk about it in that kind of language. It talks about it in more personalistic language. You might even say anthropomorphic language. Therefore, it is without form and name. And if we name it, we do not do so properly. Now, Clement knows that you have to name God. If you don't give some names to God, then you're not talking about anything. You have to name God in some way. But you have to understand that whatever name you give to God is insufficient. For instance, if you call him the One, that says something about God, but that's not sufficient. If you call him the Good, or the Mind, or Absolute Being, or Father, or God, or Creator, or Lord, we speak not as supplying his name, but for want we use good names in order that the mind may have these as points of support. In other words, there have to be some pegs in our brain that we hang ideas on. And so you don't call God Father because he is exactly like what you, the people that you are related to as sons in this world. He's not exactly like your father. But you take the name that has been given to your father and to other fathers as one of the names by which you try to comprehend something about the nature of God. Not everything about the nature of God, but something about it. So these names kind of give the mind points of support so as not to err in other respects. For instance, if you're going to call God Father, that among other things personalizes God. So God is not an impersonal entity or an impersonal process or an impersonal tapioca pudding, as C.S. Lewis said. And some people's view of God is that God is a great big tapioca pudding. That is, he's just big and powerful, but he's not really personal. In that case, from the perspective of Christian theology, that conception of God is more primitive, because a conception of God in which God is not personal is historically more primitive than a conception of God in which he is personal. In mythology, the gods are simply personifications of natural processes. The natural processes aren't personal. The gods are just the personification of those things. In Judaism and Christianity, God is person, and that's why we are persons. So it's possible then for human beings to talk about God as a person, because we know something about what it means for us to be persons. That doesn't exhaust the meaning of person when you apply it to God, but at least it gives us something to hold on to. For each one by itself does not express God, but all together are indicative of the power of the omnipotent. There again, omnipotent is an Aristotelian word. You don't go to the Bible to find omnipotent, omniscient, omnipresent. Those are all Aristotelian terms. They are not contradictory to the Christian or the biblical view of God, but they say something about God in a slightly different way that sometimes can cause problems in explicating the Christian faith. For instance, God is omnipotent. Well, the Bible also believes that God is all-powerful, but since the Bible is talking about a personal story, the story of God, God, according to the Bible, can deliberately limit his own power. Plato's God can't do that, because Plato's God is not a person who is trying to be in relationship to human beings. But the whole story of Jesus, from the perspective of Christian thought, is that God is God's self-limitation of himself. In Jesus, God empties himself and becomes a servant. The one doesn't even contemplate such a thing. So that's the reason why when you adopt Aristotelian or other kinds of philosophical ideas, you need to understand that at some juncture, these might actually be detrimental to understanding the Christian view of God. Another philosophical idea about God is that he is impassionate. That is, he does not have passion. Well, you better be careful about that idea. And a lot of Christians have not been careful about that idea, so they've talked about God as being impassionate. How can you read the Bible and think of God as impassionate? So what I'm saying again is in the Bible view of God, God has more character than the philosophical view of God. God has more personal character. So God can love in a personal way, not just in a kind of a surrounding way, but in a personal way. God can grieve about the problems and the suffering of his creation. God can even participate, according to the Bible, in the suffering of his people. The Platonic God cannot do that. So when you come to trying to understand the story of Jesus, you have to understand the concept of the suffering of God. Because what Jesus shows, according to Christians, is that God is willing to suffer to bring about redemption, reconciliation with the human beings, with the persons that he has created. In other words, the fact that they've gone away from him does not stop him from full-time work trying to get them back. That is a passionate God. Now, obviously, when we say God grieves, we're just using something in our own experience to talk about God, which doesn't fully comprehend what it means for God to grieve. Because if God can grieve, then that means he hurts worse than all of us together. He has the capacity to hurt more than all of us together. And that's an important idea in Christianity that was obscured all the way through the Middle Ages because of their adoption of the Platonic view of God and the Aristotelian view. Now notice this. This even sounds more modern. Clement himself shows a remarkable flexibility, at least for the times, in his choice of symbols and descriptive metaphors for God. Thus, while typically referring to God in masculine terms, as the Bible does, he can write, and this is a quote from Clement of Alexandria in 100 and something AD, in his ineffable essence, he is Father. In his compassion to us, he became Mother. The Father, by loving, became feminine. We know modern feminist theologians think they invented that idea. That is an idea which you can still find all the way through medieval theology. That does not mean that the term mother takes the place of the term father in the doctrine of the Trinity. It doesn't do that. But the doctrine of the Trinity, from the perspective of these philosophical theologians, was a profound enough doctrine that certainly it could include the feminine. God is not a male. He transcends being a male. He's also not a female. He transcends being a female. But since he is the creator of all things male and female, and since he teaches by revelation that we should act in certain ways, there are certain ways that because of male testosterone, males will act in a different way from the way females will act. Well, God has the capacity to act sometimes in a more feminine way. Now that may sound like female chauvinist pigism, I don't know, but these theologians certainly are not trying to say that men and women are not different. In fact, they're saying the opposite. Men and women are different. They're not yet discussing the social equality of men and women, but men and women are different, and God has created men to have certain characteristics that women do not have and have to have men for, and he created women to have certain characteristics that men as a whole do not have. There's nothing absolutely rigid about that, because our social roles obviously can change depending on the society and sociology and so forth. But one of the things that a lot of modern feminism has lost, it seems to me, is that is that the oppression of women by males over the centuries is so sinful and so wrong because it has not allowed the unique sensitivities and sensibilities of women to make up very much of how a culture acts and how a culture develops itself. And so, again, it's a problem of fullness, not exclusiveness. From the perspective of these Christian writers, we should let all of our masculinity free, all of our femininity free, and people should be, if they're men, they should be men. If they're women, they should be women, and there's nothing wrong with that. Just like there's nothing wrong with being a human being. And human beings are men and women. There's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with being a child. When you're a child, there's some characteristics. For instance, Jesus talks about one characteristic of children that is of a higher spiritual level than of adults, and that is a child's ability to have faith in a kind of an unalloyed, pure way. There's nothing wrong with that. Anyway, the reason why I quote all this is to show that philosophical and intellectual high levels of Christian theology didn't wait for modern people. Modern people have what C.S. Lewis calls a chronological snobbery. They think that modern people are the only ones that have thought about these things and have thought about a profound conception of God. Because most people, even most Christians, live their whole lives with a conception of God that probably stopped its development when they were 17 or 18, or even earlier. You know, if there are probably Christians all over the world who think of God as an old man with a beard, sitting off somewhere on a throne. Well, from the biblical perspective, God is a person sitting on a throne, but our image of it is a very limited image, and if we confuse that with the whole, or if we confuse that with the real understanding of God, then we've stopped our theological development. And so one of the things that we need to learn from these theologians, in fact, a couple of them use this expression: theology is faith seeking understanding. It's not understanding seeking faith. In other words, you do not try to prove God exists before you believe in Him. You believe in Him, and then you try to understand who He is and how He is saving you. That would help lots of people in the modern world, because a lot of people today confuse theology with faith. And you can have a great amount of faith. My grandmother didn't go to school, but I couldn't possibly claim to have as much faith as she had. And so a theologian or an intellectual or an ethicist can't claim that because of his intellectual or educated capacity that he is any more saved than anybody else. An ethicist or a teacher is simply one who has been given, according to the early church, has been given the gift by God to pursue understanding and then to be able to communicate it to other people. Well, we need to look at a thinker who is even more substantially important for the history of the Christian church, and that's St. Augustine. Augustine was born to a Christian mother and a pagan father. He was not a Christian until he was in his 20s. In the meantime, he did just about everything there was to do in a pagan society. In fact, he did so much that his conscience hurt him the rest of his life. He was especially evidently supplied with a over amount of testosterone. And so he did all kinds of things during his life, including having at least 2 concubines, or 2 mistresses, I guess we would call them today. But he lived with this mistress for several years, had a child. Augustine had a child, so there's probably somebody in Houston who is a descendant of Augustine. Probably doesn't know who it is. But Augustine had a child. But after he had his child, he was so sensitive to wanting to be moral that he thought the way to be moral was to give up sex. And so he became a Manichae. And the Manichaees were the most extreme group that sometimes even call themselves Christians, but they were the most extreme group in their understanding of the goodness of matter. They just believed matter was evil. And if matter is evil, then the human body is evil. And if the human body is evil, then enjoying good food is evil. Enjoying sex is evil. Enjoying all kinds of things are evil. Well, that appealed to Augustine because he figured that the way to cleanse his soul. That is a very powerful spirituality. You know, we hear a lot of words, a lot of talk these days about spirituality. Spirituality is not one thing. There are all kinds of spiritualities. There's a spirituality that thinks that matter is good. There's a spirituality that thinks that matter is evil. And a lot of the spiritualities that are arising in the United States tend almost to the Manichae or to the Gnostic, because they don't pay much attention to the value and the goodness of human life in this world, the human body. Christian ethics deals with embodiment. We are embodied. We are not spirits. We are embodied. One of the ethical principles we might get from what I said at the beginning of this class is that when your stomach hurts, your whole body hurts. That's kind of an ethical principle. That means that you have to pay attention to your bodiliness. And sometimes the reason why your body hurts is because you've done something unethical. You've not treated your body as the temple of God, or you've not treated your body in the light of the fact that you have people who depend on you. One kind of example of that is modern medicine has produced all kinds of remedies and helps for diseases that couldn't be helped before. Both of my children would be dead right now if they had been born the same year I was born, because they have both had problems which, if they had been born the year I was born, they would have died. And so we can be thankful that these kind of things have been provided to us. And we can also consider it an ethical decision as to whether we take advantage of these or not. In other words, if, for instance, I'm diagnosed with sickle cell anemia, or I'm diagnosed with diabetes or something like that, or I'm diagnosed with very high blood pressure, it's really an ethical decision as to whether you take your medicine or not. Why is that an ethical decision? Why is that a social decision? Sometimes we think that's just an individual decision. It's my body, I can do what I want to with it. But think about that. How is embodiment important for Christian ethics? Why would it possibly be immoral for me to refuse to take my medicine now that I have it? Yeah.
Well, I guess if you believe that your body truly is the temple of God, then you would do anything that's humanly possible to to keep that, to preserve that for as long as possible.
Yeah. That deals with the ethical responsibility to your body itself. If you mistreat your body in one of the ways that we're talking about, and for instance you die at age 35, and your children are left, and your wife is left, and your mama is left, you have not just done something that has affected you. You have been immoral because you have unethically deprived these people of something they need. Your mama needs you as long as she's alive. Your children need you, and so forth. So that's what I mean by saying that just kind of a natural way of understanding what is important because we are embodied. And Augustine kind of put a kink in some of our ethics of embodiment because he thought that he would become holier if he depressed or suppressed his bodily enjoyments of life. But in order to look at the whole vision of St. Augustine, we have to look at several sections, and we're going to talk about some of these more than others. One is Augustine's idea of moral will. He came to understand that under the impact of Christian thought. That means that he has been converted to a certain extent from Manichaeism. And he now realizes, at least in his later writing, he now realizes that nothing in and of itself is evil. Everything that exists is good. Well, if everything that exists is good, sometimes when we're studying Genesis in one of my other classes, and Genesis says that God created this, and he said, it's good. And he created this and says it's good. Well, somebody always says, well, what about sin? Doesn't sin exist? Not in the sense in which Augustine is talking about sin. In the sense that Augustine is talking about sin and evil do not exist. They are the corruption of what is good. The will of God, or the will of a human being, is a moral will. And as long as the moral will was aimed toward God and was in proper connection with God, proper relationship to God, then the moral will was doing good things. Properly related to God, the moral will was properly related to everybody else. So a moral will that's properly related to God treats everybody else the same. But a moral will which is improperly related to God becomes itself God. In other words, it becomes an idolatry when we make our will higher than God's will. And when we make our will higher than God's will, we also make our will higher than all of our fellow human beings. We'll make our will higher than my wife's, or my will higher than my friends. And that is what causes the disruption, the alienation. You're alienated from yourself, and you're alienated from everybody else because you're alienated from God. This is a theocentric view of ethics. If you're properly related to God, then you will, by the very nature of that relationship, be properly related to other human beings. And so Augustine calls sin, says that the basic sin is what he calls pride. Now, Augustine is referring to pride in kind of the Hubris does not mean pride in the sense that I'm proud of my children for making A's in school, or I'm proud of my country for doing something right, or I'm proud of my family. That's not what is considered evil by Augustine. What is considered evil, hubris, means inordinate self-centeredness, inordinate pride. Inordinate self-centeredness, for instance, is what causes family feuds. Inordinate self-centeredness is what causes wars. Inordinate self-centeredness is what causes me to mistreat my wife or my children or my friends. Because I'm inordinately self-centered, I have become God, and I will do anything for who the God is I worship. And if you're in the way, you better duck if I am inordinately self-centered. So from Augustine's perspective, that's what sin is, being inordinately self-centered. And so salvation, redemption, will mean that the moral will, which cannot get itself back into proper relationship to God, has to be conquered by God's Spirit and brought back into proper relationship to God. Again, it's very theocentric. This is not a moralism. Augustine doesn't believe that you can get up in the morning and make a New Year's resolution and be good, because you don't have any practice in being good. All of your practice has been in being self-centered and in hurting other people. So what you have to do is to change your whole is to have your whole moral will redeemed or changed by the grace of God and by the Spirit of God. We'll talk some more about that. He also writes about the two cities, which is kind of his social ethic, and that's important for later Christian history. He talks about peace and justice, the doctrine of just war, human sexuality, the use of enjoyment of riches. Let's go into some of those while we still have a few minutes. To Augustine, there is no evil outside the will. God, the Creator, has created only good things, and there is no other Creator alongside God. Sin, therefore, is error or untruth. It is based upon a mistaken conception of what is good for us. It's not just error. That would be kind of a New Age view of sin, just to say that evil is just an error that you can correct by your intellect. But if you analyze sin intellectually, you can classify sin as an error. It's an error in your relationship to God. It's an error in your relationship, therefore, to other people. Augustine, just like Clement and some of these other older folks, talk about everything that exists is good, because it is the creation of God who is good, and God cannot create something that's evil. Even in the story of Satan, or the story of the devil, you know, the popular story of the devil is that the devil was an angel who stood before God and for some reason rebelled against God. Well, the Bible doesn't talk much about that subject. But the reason that story makes some sense to Christianity is because it clears God from making evil. That is, even Satan was not created evil. Satan went bad because of the corruption of his moral will. Now, whatever you think about Satan or the devil, the story of Satan and the devil is not dualism like in the Manichaeism. In Manichaeism, Satan was evil itself, whereas in Judaism and Christianity, Satan was not created evil, but has somehow corrupted his moral will. In that sense, Satan and human beings are no different, because that's what human beings have also done. That's the reason why when you talk about a human being doing something evil, you can say the devil made me do it. Well, that may be true, but that doesn't take away your moral responsibility for it. Because if you do something evil, it's the same reason why Satan, considered in a broad way, does something evil, because his moral will has been corrupted. Connected with that, by the way, is, which we'll see in later Christian theology, a lot of these people talked about the idea that God does not exist. Everything that's created exists, but God does not exist. That's one of the ideas that actually derived from Greek philosophy. That is, that God does not exist. Everything that exists stands outside of God. If God exists, then he could have a beginning and an end. Even later philosopher like David Hume said that the existence of God is not provable, because you cannot prove the existence of anything. Hume was not saying there was no God, but he was saying that you cannot prove the existence of God, because you can't prove the existence of anything, because anything that exists is not necessary. Well, that means if you think of God as necessary, as before everything that exists, but that he has created everything that exists good, because that's his character, there is still a difference between God and his creation. And one way to talk about that difference is that we exist, but God is beyond existence. Sin is not simply intellectual error, it is a misdirection of the will. Augustine writes that human pride is the root of all sin. But and what is pride, he says? But an appetite for inordinate exaltation. Inordinate exaltation. I've run into lots of pop psychologists in my teaching career who blame all modern psychological problems on Augustine, because Augustine said that pride was the original sin. Well, they are not understanding Augustine. They say, well, I have people coming into my office whose problem is not pride, it's a problem of self-image. Well, Augustine's concept of pride includes everything that a psychologist would see in his office, because a lack of self-image within itself comes as a result of being improperly related to God. If you were properly related to God, then you would know your real value, and therefore you would know that your value is no less or no greater than anyone else. And so that fits perfectly with Augustine's conception of pride, because pride means inordinate exaltation of self. The problem with somebody who is extremely shy is not that it's not merely that he doesn't think enough of himself, it's that he thinks too much of himself. If he can get rid of his self, then he'll be more open and free to relate to other people. In other words, both what we call arrogance and what we call self-deprecating, both of these are the result of pride from Augustine's perspective. That is, that we don't have a proper relationship to God. If we had a proper relationship to God, we would know that we're not God. And if we had a proper relationship to God, we would also know our value. There's nothing wrong with not being God. God created us not to be God. He created us to be human beings. So that means that for Christians, Jesus, one of the reasons why Jesus came was to show us how to be fully human. And to be fully human, one of the characteristics is meekness. And meekness does not mean letting people walk all over you because you don't feel good about yourself. Meekness means having a proper estimate of your value, and yet not feeling the need to lord it over somebody else. That's the way in which Moses is called meek, or Jesus is called meek. A meek person is a person who does not have to hit you back. It's not because he's just too weak to hit you back. A meek person is one who doesn't have to hit you back. When I was in school, one of my fellow students was a Korean veteran of the Korean War, and his name was Tiny. And as you can imagine, that's because he weighed about 360 pounds. And Tiny was the meekest man I have ever known because of his experiences in the Korean War, because of his seeing death and cruelty and so forth. He came back a changed person. And he was an extremely meek person. He wouldn't hurt a fly. But if you walked up behind Tiny without letting him know, you're liable to get killed, because his arm would just go like that, woof, to whoever walked up behind him, because he had traumatic syndrome, and so when somebody came up behind him, he thought, well, here comes a Chinese soldier behind him or something. So you had to walk very carefully around Tiny. But as far as his heart, his moral will was concerned, he would not hurt anybody. And somebody could have just punched him in the nose and he wouldn't have done anything. That's a meek person, not a weak person. So exaltation is inordinate when the soul cuts itself off from the source to which it should keep close, and somehow makes itself and becomes an end to itself. The only reason why you would feel the necessity of punching somebody in the nose is because you are not you do not value yourself properly. You either have an overestimate of your value or an underestimate of your value. And therefore you have an underestimate of everybody else. Augustine thus grounds Christian ethics in the moral will, not in the goodness or evil of objects outside the will. The will is good or bad in accordance with what it worships and loves. And we've already talked about the fact that all of these early theologians have to worry with the question of money, whether money is good or evil. And Augustine answers that question very radically. Money is not evil. Wealth is not evil. All money is a symbolic representation of wealth. But if you're not properly related to God, then you will be improperly related to everything, including money. And if money is your God, you will do anything for your God. Now, if you understand yourself, you will understand, if you've lived long enough, that you have probably done something for money, or done something for some other personal benefit that you regret doing because it actually deprives somebody else, or it hurts somebody else. What Augustine would say is that you have simply been guilty of idolatry, because if you were not guilty of idolatry, if you were not guilty of inordinate pride, then you would have not needed what belonged to somebody else in order to make yourself more valuable. You would have not needed to walk on somebody else or to deceive somebody else in order to try to enhance your own position. In the two cities, Augustine is trying to distinguish between the city of earth and the city of God. This is a problem for Christianity because Jesus said, "My kingdom is not of this world." Well, you can interpret that in two extreme ways. You can interpret that in a Manichae way. That is, the kingdom of God, spirituality, has nothing to do with history, with bodily existence, with ordinary things of life. And that's not what Jesus meant by saying, "My kingdom is not of this world." So Christians have to learn to live both in the world of God's creation, even though it's fallen, and in the world of God's redemption, namely the city of God, which may not be coextensive with the institutional church, but the city of God is where God is working out his redemptive processes within culture and within society. And this becomes very important for Martin Luther, as we're going to see later. He talks about the two kingdoms. A Christian is a citizen of the earthly kingdom, and he's a citizen of the heavenly kingdom. And there are some things that he is responsible for doing as a citizen of the earthly kingdom, and there are some things he's responsible for doing as a citizen of the heavenly kingdom. And sometimes, from Luther's perspective, those seem kind of contradictory. And the same thing is true in Augustine, except maybe not quite as much as with Luther. But, for instance, having to do with violence. Augustine is the first theologian to really institutionalize the idea that a Christian can participate in war. And he can do that as an act of love. He can't participate in revenge or in slapping somebody back, but he can participate in the defending of others. Kind of the traditional illustration of that is that you're walking down the street. You are a pacifist Christian. You don't believe in hurting anybody. And if somebody walked up to you and slapped you in the face, you wouldn't slap him back. But there's a man down at the end of the corner who is beating a little girl or a little boy. Now you have the choice. You don't have the choice of making an ethical decision. You simply have the choice as to which ethical decision you're going to make. And an absolute pacifist might make the decision not to do anything. But a Christian who is not an absolute pacifist might make the decision to defend the little girl. And in order to defend the little girl, he may have to hurt the man. So see, that's just kind of a simple illustration of how the idea of just war develops. Now, just war has been applied very loosely over the years, so that almost any war, a president or a king or an emperor can convince you is a just war. And theologians have tried several times in American history to try to convince the political leaders that a war that we're participating in is not a just war and therefore cannot be supported by Christians. They've never had much luck in that. For instance, the Spanish-American War was basically a war invented by one man just to sell newspapers. And he got the war started by telling lies about what the Spanish had done. And so Americans just got on boats and went over there and started killing Spaniards. And it was a glorious war, as all wars are supposed to be glorious. But a lot of theologians understood that that was not a defensive war. There was nothing at stake in that war except a kind of a small effort at American colonialism. And we did own colonies for a long time after that war. So just war theory arises when you are now dealing with a social community and not just with individuals relating to individuals. even in the New Testament, Jesus was not a total pacifist. He was a pacifist in terms of individual relationships. But when it came to his defense of the temple, you remember what he did. So in his attack on the temple, which was a pretty violent attack, in his attack on the temple, I don't suppose he tried to hurt any human being. But at the same time, he was trying to defend the non-powerful who were being taken advantage of by the temple authorities. So in that sense, you can say that Jesus, even though he is the world's supreme pacifist, at some points recognizes that justice and love requires that you defend. And God is the defender of the poor and the widow in the Old Testament. And so you can't get away, as far as your relationship to God, you can't get away with oppressing the poor. You may think you're getting away with it because nothing is happening to you. But God is the defender of the poor. And so you may not know it, but you're making God very angry. So in that sense, God is not a pacifist. He defends the oppressed. He defends the people who are wrongly attacked. And so there is a basis then in these early thinkers for a different ethic that would actually provide for justice within a larger community. And so Christians started being able to, with a good conscience, be policemen and judges, and even allow a Christian to be an emperor. You didn't have to live under Christian judges and an emperor in order to be a Christian. But they thought it was a good thing if it happened. And that brings up the Constantinian problem, which we're going to have to talk about, because that is one of the most important events in Christian history. So anyway, in the two cities, Augustine is trying to balance the way a Christian is supposed to act as a member of each city. The earthly city, corrupted by self-love, is destined to fail. The Roman Empire, which was the earthly city at the time of Augustine, it just crumbled. The heavenly city is still at least under cover, the most powerful city in the world. Thus, while destined to fail, the city of this world has a finality of its own. It reaches such happiness by sharing a common good as is possible when there are no goods but the things of time to afford it happiness. The aims of human civilization are good, for this is the highest end that humanity can achieve. In other words, we're not going to get an unmixed kingdom of God on earth. But for Augustine, Christianity has the power to transform society in which it has some influence. And to transform society, he thought, was the work of Christian ethics. In other words, he didn't believe that the only purpose for a Christian is just to go to church and go to heaven when you die. He believed that Christian ethics involved taking care of the world that God had created and living in the world but not being of the world. In other words, if somebody needed food, it wasn't our obligation to just tell them, well, wait till you die and go to heaven and you'll get food. You're required to give them food. In other words, your goal in life is not just to preach religion. Your goal in life is to fulfill the reason for your creation. And when you fulfill your reason for your creation and you're in proper relationship to God, you will help other people to fulfill the reason that they're created. So the heavenly city in its earthly existence is a city of pilgrims, a wayfaring company, but it still lives within the society. And in fact, the early theologians believed that it was the prayers of Christians that gave the Roman Empire whatever good it had. And things are going to be divided only at the last judgment. So this is a kind of an anti-sectarian position. Lots of sectarians want to separate from the world completely, but not Augustine. I thought we had some more time.